All right, well, welcome to Monday Morning Modernism, or for Evelyn in Paris, it may be Monday Evening Modernism. But let me tell you a little bit about our topic. And I also, if you haven't attended one of these before, I do want to say something about the spirit of these presentations. As Martha mentioned, I taught at a community college for 32 years. And these lectures really do come from that experience of teaching this material over a long period of time. And as I like to tell people, if you want a very, very highly informed kind of a PhD level, intensely accurate art historical essay, or lecture, you can find them elsewhere. What I give is really kind of a personal, informal, and lightweight version of these lectures. It's meant for enjoyment and enrichment. And if you catch me in an inaccuracy, let me know. But here we are, a Monday Morning Modernism. And as Martha mentioned, I always refer people back to Robert Hughes, the TV show and the book, Shock of the New. And the book is widely available and the videos are available for free on YouTube and ubu.com. So what I thought I'd do before getting directly to Monet is I'll do what my daughter would say. She says, "Dad, you like to get contexty." So I'll give you a little bit of context. I wanted to say something about the development of the landscape, especially in Western art, to set the scene for Monet. When you look at Renaissance art, the landscape as a subject is maybe non-existent or very, very rare. It's there as kind of a backdrop. So for example, when you look at Botticelli, I guess you could call this a landscape, but it seems to be a landscape maybe by someone that hasn't ever been to the ocean, which I doubt that was true, but he hadn't observed the moods of the ocean. We get this almost kind of embroidered tapestry of wavelets behind Venus in her half shell. And when you look at the mythological grove that is behind the image of spring, the allegorical image of spring, we can see that each leaf looks like it's beautifully cut out of a piece of paper. So landscape was kind of a backdrop for mythological and historical paintings. I think the real innovators in landscape during the same era were the Chinese. And I recently heard somebody say that the greatest achievement of early Chinese culture was the landscape painting. And I'll have to think about that one, or maybe I'm not qualified to judge, but it's a very, very interesting idea. And this landscape, which as you can see, deals with atmospheric perspective to give depth of the hill, and which has all these beautiful detail as the rolling hills and the gently outlined tree. All of this is from about the same period as the Botticelli. But back to European painting, we know that the great project of European painting was to move towards a kind of a naturalism. And in this Poussin painting from the 18th century, we have a more rigorous, a more developed landscape, complete with a great deal of form and shading. And it serves to take us back to Greco-Roman times and give us this kind of classical drama in the foreground. The Dutch began to be the ones in the tradition of European painting who really looked hard at the landscape. Maybe it was the flatness of Holland, but with so much sky to look at, they began to paint and observe cloudscapes. And of course, they also painted the ocean around Holland. And those things, I think, did a lot to lead towards Impressionism, the idea that the moods of weather itself could be a subject matter for painting. In this English painting by Gainsborough, the role of the landscape is basically to back up Captain and Mrs. Andrews and to let us know they own it, however many acres are there. So the British used landscape to demonstrate class and ownership, and the French, as in Fragonard's Swing, used the landscape as the background for their aristocratic pleasures. In the early 19th century, a group of painters, including Corot and Diaz de la Peña and others, began to paint in the Fontainebleau forest on the outskirts of Paris. And their outdoor approach, their plein air painting approach, has a freshness and an informality which leads directly to not directly to today's topic, because first Turner, when you look at the work of the British painter Turner, he really made landscape have a mood. He made landscape dramatic with his great romantic approach. And all of that leads us up to not quite Monet, but Monet's mentor. You might be interested to know that the second painter that I think Monet studied with was Boudin, who was the seascape specialist. And to be a seascape specialist meant inheriting this tradition that was so developed mainly by the Dutch of showing us the changeability and the moods of weather. That meant painting outdoors. It meant painting observantly. And of course, the key to painting the ocean is that you have to find a way to paint something that is always changing, that doesn't hold, still for even the slightest moment. So that is all of the context, maybe too much context, but I wanted to tell you, where I think Monet differs and where he was coming from. In high school, you might be interested to know that Monet was a caricaturist, and this is a caricature he did, I think, in 1855. So he did start out as a fairly able representational artist who could do caricatures and portraits and figures. But his first ambitious works, his first large works that he intended as salon works, include works like this déjeuner, this luncheon of 1867. And of course, when we say déjeuner, we maybe immediately think of Manet's painting, one vowel different. And 5 years earlier, the déjeuner of 1862 that was so scandalous. And when you look at the two side by side, you really see how Monet was different from Manet in his earlier composition. Manet was so interested in making social commentary, and Monet is very, very interested in light. And here his wife, Camille, is posing the center of the picture in a kind of diaphanous white dress. It blends into this white tablecloth, and you see dappled light activating the scene. Dappled light, irregular light on the tablecloth itself, glimmering off the dish that she holds in her hand, glimmering off the backs of the figures who populate the scene. And other paintings from 1867 show you that already the subject matter of Monet's paintings, you might say it's people in gardens, but I think it's more accurate to say that his subject matter is already lighting. How does lighting fall across a lawn? How do you create complicated dappled lighting, like the lighting that's coming through trees or the lighting on these flowering fruit trees? And even, a very nice detail, the sense of lighting coming through the parasol with a kind of a yellow tinge. In Monet, in these paintings of 1867, you already can feel the breeze blowing. And look at this terrace at San Andres, and you can see that the steamboats on the horizon, you can see which way the wind is blowing because of their smoke. And then that's seconded by the clouds that seem to be moving along. And if you didn't get it from the horizon, you get it from the flags. You see those, blowing in a certain direction. So you get the direction of the breeze. You also get the time of day and the direction of lighting, and you get it very precisely because the shadows behind the chairs tell you where the sun is located in the sky. And this is something that would become kind of an obsession for Monet, is creating paintings where you really could tell what time of day it was from the position of shadows. So look at the way his art blossoms after this period in the early 1870s. This fantastic scene of boats on a shore. There are so many visual rhymes and so much sensitivity in this painting. One that I enjoy is the pebbled texture of the beach, rhyming off the very, very complicated cloud break in the sky. And I've always heard it said that one of the most difficult things to paint is the effect of light coming towards the viewer from a canvas. Or as a friend of mine said in graduate school, it would be nice if you could just put a lamp behind your painting. And that would be cheating. But to get that feeling of light coming towards you is so challenging. And I think that Monet achieves it in this canvas. You know, the light against dark, you see some highlights toward the center of the painting where you feel maybe that's the place that the sun has tucked itself behind the clouds. And it still is a bit of a moody day, but mood is the point. Finally, you see reflections, like you see the reflections of the silhouetted sailboats against the water, and you see hints of wavelets on the current. And that would become another thing that was a real obsession of Monet. So in this scene of a bridge at Argenteuil, look how much attention has been given to the reflections and to the light on the water. And when this comes on the screen, I'm not sure what the first thing you look at is, but I have to tell you, the reflection takes me in right away. It's almost like the boat and the bridge and then the horizon are secondary. And there are so many places in the painting where reflection is important. For example, take a look at the pylons of the bridge. And of course, you see shadow in the upper half of those pylons, but look how much blue and yellow, look how much the lighting coming off of the river itself is reflected onto the bridge. Nobody had painted structure that way before, because Monet was really not interested in the architecture as much as he was interested in what did the light do to the architecture and how did it change our experience of it. So, you know, brilliant new effects that he's achieving in painting. This is a very small painting of a kind of an island. It's one of those places where Renoir also painted, where there's floating cafe, floating island out on the water. And of course, we know that one of the subjects of Impressionist painting was always the pleasures of the new emerging middle class. But again, if this is about the pleasures of the middle class themselves really look like little impasto brushstrokes. They look like bits of macaroni in top hats. The brushwork is very, very abbreviated because Monet's not interested in detail in any conventional way. He's interested in what he called the envelope. And the envelope is a way of saying that the feeling of light should be consistent throughout a painting. That when you're painting a time of day, the relationship between the light and the shadows, the sense of contrast, all of that has to be accurate. And you get the feeling that's what he fussed over almost more than anything else. And fantastic abstract things happening, let's say in the lower right image of the painting, where you see the little boat that there's only half of the prow of the boat poking into the composition. But look what happens to the lines of the boat as they kind of ripple and partly vanish into the reflection of the water itself. It's almost as if weather and light and reflection distracted Monet so much from life that life became kind of the backdrop, secondary. It's the reverse of what we saw in the earlier European landscapes, where they themselves used nature as a backdrop. So this is a painting from I think the early 1870s, 1872 or 1873. And I look at this and I think there's a real maturity now in Monet. He's doing something that hasn't been done before. His style has become so distinctive. And it's the painting of his wife, Camille, with his son, Michel, standing beside her. And look at all the things that are happening in that painting. In a sense, he's trying to paint the same painting that he painted in 1867. You know, Camille in a white outfit. But look how she has a very, very different relationship to nature now. It's almost like she's, you know, one of the clouds or blowing with the clouds. And she has a transparent veil over her face. Her sun is lit, you know, distinctly from the backlighting of the clouds. The view is slightly obscured by nature itself and the forms of all these grasses and flowers and weeds and everything else. So it's really a portrait of a woman in nature that gives us a new relationship to the subject matter. And something I want to say about Monet and his life, if you have a chance to read his biography, you'll want to know that this was actually from a very, very difficult period in his life. Even when, you know, he's painting things that are absolutely lovely, he was a very anxious guy. He had money trouble. And not that much later, Camille would pass away, and he painted her on her deathbed, not that differently from the kind of veiled way that he painted her on the hill. And one of the things that complicated her many health problems was malnutrition. So, I mean, that gives you a different view of Impressionism. But Monet was a guy, I understand he smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. And in a sense, what his art was, it was a way to calm himself, to immerse himself in the beauty of the world, even when he often was dealing with great personal difficulties. This is the painting that actually gave Impressionism its name. And Impressionism, like many art historical names, was a bit of a jab. This was in a show where a critic named Louis Leroy, basically compared it to wallpaper. Some critics felt like there wasn't enough in this small study to be a painting. And it's true that the subject matter is very, very reduced. I mean, the boat and the rower are just done the way they would have been done in a Chinese painting, maybe a Japanese or Chinese painting as a silhouette. The harbor itself seems to be like an abstract kind of a jumble of tonal forms. The bold orange sun, done in cadmium orange, is like something Turner would have done, a striking counterpoint to all of that gloom. But somehow it comes together and gives this unified mood or envelope. It gives a tremendous feeling of place and mood that gives us a fantastic impression. Monet painted by the seashore quite a bit. There are a couple of stories of him being knocked over with his easel by waves when he wasn't paying attention, when the tide was coming in. But he really was attracted to the wildness of the sea and tried to paint that. He often painted many small canvases that he would just work on for a few minutes and then shift to another one because the light was changing, the time of day was changing. So they often were very rapidly made paintings. And when he painted in the city, I think his city paintings are interesting because he paints them really like he was at the ocean, honestly. I mean, when you look at this boulevard painting, when you look at it up close, you can see that he's very, very interested in the tonality. He's interested in the kind of snow-covered boulevard and the weather, and the people themselves are just daubs. They are just kind of populating this greater abstract composition. When he painted the railway stations in Paris in the late 1870s, one story goes that he bribed the engineers of several of the trains to blow more steam into the station. Because again, what really, really interested him was atmosphere. And you can see in this picture of a rail station, yes, there is the geometry of the metal architecture of the building itself. And yes, there's the architecture of Paris's boulevards behind, but it is the sense of light and color and atmosphere, the smoke, that was very, very important to the effect he wanted this painting to have. Before I go into Monet's series, I want to say something about his palette. And I know many of you are painters, so you've probably noticed this instinctively, but the Impressionist palette, the palette of Monet was so different from the palette of 100 or 200 years before. Many of the old masters that we admire, like Rembrandt or Velasquez, worked with a palette that often had as few as 4 colors. They didn't have what Monet had, which was ultramarine blue and cadmium or chrome or yellow. They didn't have these kind of newer synthetic coal tar colors. And looking at this palette that Monet's son preserved and then donated to the museum at Giverny, you can see how bright and bold his warm tones and his yellows and greens were, and how he really used quite a bit less of umbers or blacks or browns that might have been so important for an old master painter. So Monet began to work in series in the 1880s, and this very famous series of haystacks was actually shown first in Boston because he was still having trouble getting critical traction in Europe. And his life had changed quite a bit. After Camille died, he did not remarry, but he did have a long time, we'd call her now a domestic partner, who brought stepchildren with her, and they moved in together. Life got better, but also maybe more complicated, and he was needing to make a great deal of money to try and support this growing family. So he began to show these series of, I'll try and say it in French, mules, or haystacks that he would have seen in Normandy. And in a way, what kind of a, unimposing or unexpected subject matter. I mean, just a pile of hay put into a characteristic shape. But what happened around it when Monet took this on as subject matter was absolutely spectacular. And he did things with the Impressionist palette, with the contrast of warm and cool, that were unexpected, that in a way were unnatural. So if a critic would have said, the lighting here is very exaggerated or unnatural, I'm sure Monet would have had to concede that. But look what's happening where he tries to bring warm light around the edge of a haystack, and he does it with pinks and reds, even as the yellow seems to be wrapping around. Painting it in the winter, he found cool blues and violets that opened up the chromatic range of the composition. Sometimes the paint work was rougher, and there was a lot of what you'd call wet on wet, which means that a lot of the color mixing happened directly on the study itself rather than happening on the palette. Here's an example of light blue shadows, ultramarine mixed with white. That's very, very unusual, but that began to be a characteristic of Impressionist painting, was blue and purple shadows rather than shadows derived from, say, black or brown. You can see how the stripes of light and shadow activate that composition as diagonals. The touch of his paintbrush becomes very, very important as these, build up. They have a great deal of texture or impasto. So you get a very, very sensual exercise in seeing and feeling how he applied the paint, how he layered it. But there's a new state of mind that's showing up in Monet. And the state of mind is, it's not so much what you paint, it's what you do with it. And the subjectivity that we talked about in Cezanne becomes, explodes into this kind of fabulous thing of, a structure, something as permanent as a cathedral in this next series can be absolutely different depending on your perception of it, depending on the time of day, and depending on some rather arbitrary color experiments that you might bring to it. So Monet made more than 30 of these Rouen Cathedral paintings. And when he made them, because of its tallest spire, this was one of the tallest structures, or maybe the tallest structure in the world, until the Eiffel Tower came along. And he rented both a hotel room, and then sometimes he took space in an unused women's lingerie shop across the street. He'd work on multiple canvases. He'd work on several at a time and just sequester himself there. And he painted the cathedral, rather the way that he had painted the haystacks. And I want to make the point that if you've visited these great cathedrals, they are in a way like libraries of information. I mean, they have all these carvings of French nobility, French kings, of biblical figures, of saints, and you can kind of read the stained glass windows, you can read the carvings, so they are full of information. And that kind of information absolutely did not interest Monet. In fact, I think what someone once said about this particular painting was that it looked like a melting ice cream cone. And that's not inaccurate. You couldn't identify a saint, you couldn't identify Mary or Christ, even if they were, over the center of the arch. Again, you get this kind of great reflection of atmosphere, as if you're understanding the presence of the structure, in a certain perceptual way, but the details don't seem to matter. And maybe I'm interpreting a little bit, but I almost feel like Monet's letting us know that he has a different feeling about religion. Maybe he has a more modern feeling about religion, where he doesn't need to know each story or to have this kind of narrative that the cathedral represents. Instead, he's letting you know how he feels about the presence of the cathedral. How does it feel as a piece of history? How does it feel as a monumental presence? How does it feel as something that he has to read again and again to understand the different moods of weather as they change his relationship to it? I mean, so what creative vigor he brought to all of this. You can just see that he was absolutely never bored, because even though he painted the same structure again and again, it felt different to him every time. Or maybe he forced the issue. Maybe he forced himself to feel differently about it each time. I mean, who knows? Because he did have a tremendous work ethic. But a huge variety of surfaces, of textures, of color combinations. In a sense, they're abstract paintings. Or maybe a way to think about it, they're like abstract paintings that had to begin with something. And the something in this case is a monumental historical structure. Feels like a travesty to go so quickly, but I just want to give you food for thought. You can take them on later through Wikipedia and enjoy each one. One more series is the Poplars. And I understand that when he was working on these, he got started with this series. And then he found out that the mayor of the local town that managed this area had actually sold some of the poplars to a lumber yard. And he went and he bribed the mayor of the town to leave them up longer so he could finish his series, because working on site was so important to his process. And just as he did with the cathedrals, he took tremendous liberties with the coloration, with the mood, with the atmosphere, with the composition. Again, that feeling of the subjectivity of modern art is so important to what he conceived. This one, look at the color contrast. Look at those fantastic kind of violets and blues that run across the center of this in a ragged band, and then the contrast with, out of the tube, vivid chrome yellows and hints of orange and pink. Fabulous, unexpected color combinations. And even though I told you that Monet didn't particularly like detail, he did use very fine brushwork sometimes to create density, as he did in this composition. Couldn't resist having them reflect on the water, and it creates this composition that seems to get broader and open up towards us as we get to the right side of the painting. So in the last part of his life, he moved to Giverny, which some of you have probably had a chance to visit. If you haven't, it's a fantastic tourist attraction, maybe an hour outside of Paris by bus. And at Giverny, his life there went in stages. He lived there more than 30 years, and at first it was a rental, then he bought it, then he expanded it. A little bit later still, he bought more acreage and he added the pond where he made his water lily paintings. But it really was an artist's home, in that every single room seemed to be themed or colored almost as if you were stepping inside a painting. So for example, here's the yellow dining room with blue and white Japanese prints and painted furniture. And looking at Monet's bedroom, it brings to mind a story I've heard about him, that Alice was his second wife or second companion, that she often had a lot of trouble getting him up out of bed in the morning. And this is Monet's bedroom with the yellow headboard or footboard. So she would have been up there maybe urging him to get out and paint. He'd look out those windows and feel grumpy, and he wouldn't do it if the conditions weren't just right. And of course, the gardens, which were increasingly tended by large groups of gardeners, yielded all of the subject matter that he needed for his paintings. He didn't need to travel anymore. I think he called it his harem of nature, is what he was able to cultivate at Giverny. He had a very, very large studio built, where after World War I, he worked on this fantastic cycle of broad mural-sized paintings of water lilies that are now at l'Orangerie in Paris. And I have a rare 1914 film of Monet painting. And of course, it's grainy and black and white, but we'll watch a little bit and you'll get a feeling for him at work at his home. He was visited by a lot of painters, especially Americans in this era, famous. And you can see he's enjoying being the grandee and entertaining visitors. I'll move forward from that. And, I don't know if you were noticing, but it looked like somebody needed to flick the ashes off his cigarette. I don't know why painting a weeping willow out next to, the pond, why you'd need to smoke a cigarette. But there he was. What a gorgeous situation. Something of interest, if you've ever seen some of Monet's very late paintings, he had cataracts at a certain period. And when you see, for example, this painting he did of his Rose Alley, where it gets very, very dark, he did that while he was suffering from cataracts, and then he had surgery to remove them. And cataract surgery now is very, very easy comparatively. I understand he had to be sandbagged in the hospital bed, to hold him steady after the cataracts removed. But he did make a comeback after that and worked on this fantastic, late cycle of paintings for l'Orangerie. I'll let the paintings speak for themselves in their loveliness, but I'll tell you maybe a little bit about what I think they mean to artists or what they mean to art history. Monet really, increasingly, it seems like in his career, he just began to look down. It's like the horizon disappeared because the imagery of the pond and the reflections and the water lilies were all that he needed. So it's a very, very complete world. And it was a subject matter that could be easily moved towards abstraction in its loveliness. And that really was the direction he was moving, down from the horizon, letting human beings be out of the picture or maybe implied now and then by a bridge or a boat. And he developed these kind of great all over compositions that are very, very large in format, so that when you're observing them, you really get a sense that you're in them. You're having an experience very, very much like the experience he had making them. And his brushwork was, just unbelievably fluid and loose and abstract, as you can see here in the detail. Each water lily might be just a clot of paint. And I had somebody tell me that, this is another painter who told me that he feels that Monet was getting sometimes 4 or 5 colors on one brush. He was loading the heel of the brush and then dipping the edges and putting something in the center. And that may be true, that he loaded the brushes in such a way to just let these fantastic kind of spontaneous mixtures of color come off on the canvas. And here's a lovely quote from late in his career. He says, "It took me time to understand my water lilies. I cultivated them without ever thinking of painting them. And then suddenly the magic world of my pond was revealed to me." So I guess in a sense, he's saying that he really didn't know how involved or how complete the world of the water lilies would be until he made that his subject matter. And I have a few images here of individual panels from L'Orangerie. So hopefully you can take in that feeling of floating, of standing in front of them and being part of the painting as they seem to blow by you almost like clouds. You can appreciate that when you stand in front of them, you very much have a feeling that you're there with the man who's making them. You can feel his brushwork. You can feel his mistakes. You can feel his decisions. You can feel the accidents that happened while he was painting. And then this is just 45 seconds, but here's a video I found that just will give you a feeling of the scale of the room. If you were there on a day without other tourists, which, you know, that never happens, but if you were there, what would it feel like to just stand in the center and spin your head around and feel you are completely in this world? They're from the end of the artist's life, and he was having a lot of difficulties when he painted them, but he also had a lot of encouragement from a man named Clemenceau, from a government minister, and I'm sure he would have thought of them as his Sistine Chapel, as his masterpiece. So just an ending thought, because as you learned early on, I like context. I really think that Monet opened the doors for all kinds of painting. And when I look at the work of Jackson Pollock, you know, the feeling of being all over, of having no horizon, of having all kinds of painterly energy take up the canvas, I somehow think that Monet led us to Jackson Pollock. I don't know if Pollock would agree with that. I haven't heard many other people say that, but there is something, you know, that they have in common in the expansiveness of their paintings.